What's up, guys? Welcome to the Lioneye Watch. Join us around the fire. For tonight, we have GGG developer Carl de Visser on for a talk about some Path of Exile with a focus on the creation of Breach League. I hope you're doing good, Carl. Thank you for joining us. And why don't you go ahead and tell us about your role at GGG, from where you started and then
Um,
where you are today?
sure. So I've been at Grinding Gear Games over 5 years. I think it's not 6 yet. It's a bit over 5. So I started shortly, very, very shortly after the closed beta started when 092 was out. And I had a fair bit to do with 093 when there was a whole lot of changes to some of the core systems. So that sort of changed the combat model and a few other things. So I was hired to do game design and production. And that started off as sort of non-stop game design. Before then, Chris had been the person doing all the game design as well as all the other stuff he did. And increasingly that's involved doing more and more production and less game design. So we now have a team of 8 game designers total. So that's people who do 100% of their time game design, on top of the fact that there's lots of other people involved doing sort of bits of pieces of game design here and there. For example, the 3 founders, Eric, Chris, and Jonathan, are still pretty involved in the broad strokes of what the game is and what it's like. So in between all those other people making themselves heard, it's I occasionally get to have my way and say my opinions, but other than that, they do most of the work, and then I focus on making sure the patches come together and the important bit of production, which is making sure that all the sort of work is focused on the same thing. And yeah, so it's sort of been a transition from pure game design to game design and production mixed, and now that we've got 80 people, there's a lot of production work to do.
How did you originally get to meet Chris? Or was it just like an ad in the paper that they were hiring?
No, I'd met him at a conference, and part of this conference was you meant to say what your sort of interests were, because it was sort of generally a conference of, what's the word, kind of interesting people, and I managed to qualify
Peculiar
as
people.
interesting for some reason. And I said my interests were games, games, games. And then I met Chris, and we discussed things there, and we stayed in touch since then. And I actually came out to the offices once to look at potentially what I could do, but at the time they didn't have any tools for doing game design, so it was all very code based. And I actually, discussed what they were doing and was able to say, I don't think I can help you with this. Well, as in I couldn't, because it was hard to do anything with it, unless you're sort of one of their coders. And then later on, when they got very busy, and I said, "Oh, you should get me up there," and Chris said, "Yes, we should." And by then they had better tools to be able to do sort of design work without having to um, be a very proficient C++ coder. So, which was cool. And then I moved me and my family up to Auckland, and then ever since have been working in the offices.
Did you have a
So
bit of a preference towards the kind of earlier when you were more hands-on, or do you kind of enjoy more the leadership role when you're making sure everything's refined into the target?
I quite like both. So I think when you end up doing the production, it's mostly because you take a very strong interest in how the game goes out to people, and because of that, you sort of get hands-on at various points, and you want it to sort of be perfect when it goes out. And as soon as you do that, you end up very focused on more production sort of stuff. So I really do like the hands-on systems kind of stuff, but I also quite like having the holistic view and knowing how all the bits fit together. Um, that being said, it's pretty cool when you're fully immersed in game design, and I did amateur game design and beforehand, and then when doing game design here, it was like, well, I didn't really have any desire to work on my games at home, but as I've done more and more production, it's suddenly like, oh, I've got to work on games at home. So there's obviously this sort of need to design that sort of comes out.
oh, that's really interesting. So is with 250. is there anything that was released that you could like put your name on it, or like you had a heavy influence on the design decisions? Or it sounds like you're a bit more of the glue between different departments and making sure everything is running smoothly. But is there anything in 2.5.0 that you could call like your own?
I think this is actually the first patch where there's not something I can point at and say, oh, I did this bit. But despite the fact that there was no one bit I went, well, I did this bit all by myself, I do get to say, well, I had my say on some of the other bits, or in some cases knowing when not to have my say. So this is probably the first patch where I didn't do anything specifically. But,
Well, you
certainly
got
there
to
was...
weigh in on a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah. Breach League specifically, I didn't really need to say much or have to do much at all. Like Rory and Mark II towards the end, they did a pretty damn good job bringing it all together, and it turned out to be a very good, impressive league. So while I was aware of what was going on, I did on with it, and I think early on I said a couple of things, and there were some things I said about the uniques, but other than that, that just sort of all came together. But yeah, I got to be aware of everything and say various bits about things and try and stick it all together. Production-wise, it was moderately complicated because first we had a big technical division where there we had, leading up to 2.4.2, 2.4.3, we had all this new tech, which was on locally and then not on prod, and then it all went on to sorry, by prod I mean the live environment, so short for production, and that went on. And then as soon as that went on, we've done some rather massive changes for 3.0.0 next year. So now locally, as in on our local servers, there's some huge differences between what we've got and what's on live. And that was actually quite difficult, where we'd do some work, stick it in the branch which becomes 2.5.0, and then have to redo chunks of it. This is mostly related to changes in difficulties. So yeah, there's elements where we have assumptions about what changes each difficulty, and our assumptions locally and our assumptions on the 2.5.0 are very different now. So that got quite complicated.
Can't mix them up.
That's right.
I was just going to ask what you were doing before Path of Exile, because you actually did shortly mention games you were designing at home. So what was your history before getting into Path of Exile?
So as in work-wise for money, I was a systems engineer. I worked with a company that sort of did contract work for other organizations. And then the last year and a half of that was pretty much exclusively at a energy company, with power plants and all that sort of stuff, and they had a sort of a large VMware environment and various other servers and stuff, so it was a lot about servers and operating systems and stuff. And then in my spare time I was doing game design, and with a friend we'd published a board game called Endeavour, which did reasonably well for that kind of Euro game, which we're pretty proud of, and a ton of other games that didn't get published in any way, shape, or form as well.
So, are you working on any side projects at the moment besides Path of Exile?
I am, but they're not going very well. So it's very easy for Path of Exile to take over. And when I get home, it's sort of like, oh yeah, I'll plug away at some stuff. So my goal with them is mostly to have something to work on and to play around with code and try and get better at the code side of things. So I'm kind of working on an Advance Wars like thing, very slowly, which at first I was trying to get my head around Unity, which I didn't find straightforward at all, and then playing around with that.
In 2013, you did this thing at the Canterbury Software Cluster. You mentioned that you guys had 3-stage environments, one being production, second being the next formal patch, and the third, you mentioned that you guys don't really have that much emphasis on the third. Now that your team is doubled in size, are you guys able to go to the third and maybe even a fourth?
Let me have a look. 1, 2, 3. sorry, I'm counting. We have currently 24 environments for building to at the moment.
Holy moly! Wow.
But I don't need to worry about most of those. So for the main ones, what we have called testing or trunk, which is where everyone's work goes, and that sort of gets built to every day. And then for the main line of production, sort of we've got a staging 2, and a staging 3. And staging is a copy of what's on live. Staging 2 is sort of what's going out next. So at the moment, that's got 251 on it. And staging 3 can be whatever, but at the moment, like it's normally what's the patch after that. But at the moment, it's actually got some old stuff for some testing. And then there's a whole lot of environments to do with, like we've got sort of Garena Realms and 10-cent realms for China, and a couple of other special ones. So yeah, it's got a lot more complicated since then, and just a mere 3 years.
Yeah, that's quite the difference between 3 years ago. So just going into our topics of discussion, a question that I had was, what are your goals each league in improving Path of Exile, and what do you consider your failures and successes? And if possible, can we get some examples?
Goals each league in improving Path of Exile. So each league, there's a slight focus on something different, because there's sort of a desire to constantly improve. I think for this year in general, the main focus has been on consistency. So this year we've released every 3 months, we've managed to release a league, and sometimes an expansion with it. And at the beginning of the year, we said we were going to do like 4 of these, and we had sort of 1 week spare for the entire year, which we didn't end up using, which was actually quite a lot of work to make that happen. But that consistency, I mean, it helps with the players, as in they sort of got used to, okay, every 3 months, bang, there's a new league, 3 months, new league. Whereas last year, I think that was sort of a downfall. I don't remember if you remember all the 1 month leagues and other things that mostly filling in gaps where we were failing to do something on time. So while I think we were sort of increasing the quality of what we were doing last year, it wasn't in a timely fashion, where this year it's been much more sort of disciplined. Occasionally this means, okay, we're not doing this in this 3 months, that'll have to be bumped to the next 3 months. And having things sort of divided enough that you guys don't notice when we say, okay, this feature's just not in it all. So for example, from 250, there are at least a couple of sort of big changes, which was like, okay, this is just not happening, this one, push it to the next one, rather than delaying the league. And this requires sort of one, parceling up the work into sort of discrete sort of things, so you can literally say, okay, stop focusing on that, that happens later. And 2, very early on deciding what the scope of something is. So in the past, we were very good at sort of piling more and more work in as we were getting closer and closer. And there's certainly a strong desire for people to do that. I mean, it's very hard to make the decision not to make something cooler or better, but having a sort of defined, yes, this is what we're doing, and this is the extent, and then we stop. There's plenty of other work to do for the next one after that.
So with being the producer, I mean, I guess it's pretty easy to keep pushing back ideas to the next thing, but doesn't it pile up so much to where you just have to buckle down and say, okay, we got to have like some serious crunch time, or we need to hire some more people?
So one of the problems is people have such good ideas, it's very hard to say no to them sometimes. So particularly when you're working on a league, there's also, you've got to allow for improvements in it, or to decide this bit is not good, we have to redesign this. You can't just sort of go, no, we're not doing that, just go with what we've got if it's actually bad. Or you can look at what needs to happen, and it's like, well, it's going to be a lot better if we do that change. So there's a bit of give and take with that. Like, you do need to allow lots of iterations on things. There is a lot of kind of building one to throw away, which we've got better at. You sort of work on a prototype, you know what's good about it, and often you practically just have to rebuild it from scratch and make it better the next time. I think when you guys see something, you can usually see the 1% of something that's wrong with it. But normally we find, we often need two different people or groups of people to work on any one thing, and the first person or group kind of gets it to 95%, and they don't see the problem so well then, because they've taken it from absolutely nothing to a certain point, and then the sort of next person or group gets to go, well, obviously we need to change this, we need to remove this, and they kind of get it from 95% to 99%. And then we could spend twice as much time to get it to 99.5%, but normally by then it's like, well, we've spent 3 months on it, we better get it out the door. And then you guys get to see the 1% and go, what were they thinking? Why didn't they change this? Isn't this obvious?
How frustrating is that?
You kind of get philosophical about it. And as well, sometimes it's like, well, you should have seen it before. Last week it was completely different. And sometimes it's like, well, there's actually a very good reason for that. There was a lot of compromises, and that's actually how it has to be. It never gets to be perfect. That's part of doing it in 3 months. But I think we're doing a lot better job of iterating and improving each time. So, and I think in 2.5.0, we did a lot of stuff very well and over several times. But part of that was also 2.5.0 was mostly just Breach League and a few other bits, which was kind of handy. And there's plenty of other work on upcoming content.
Well, on the flip side, is there something that you guys worked really hard on that the community never really noticed or gave any attention to or talked about?
Usually there is. I sometimes think, like, for the Breach Leagues and the Uniques, there was a lot of work on the lore and cohesiveness of it. And while occasionally you see someone go, oh, I noticed this thing, generally people notice when that's wrong or it's a bit off, rather than when it's right. So in some ways it's a success that no one sort of commented on it. And as well as that, we sort of had, this league got sort of ties to Beyond, but we didn't want them sort of explicitly noted. But all the bits where people go, oh, this is just like this, or hey, I've noticed this thing, and that's pretty cool to notice. So
time to dredge up the lore and figure out the ties with Beyond. You actually mentioned very quickly that the kind of 1 month or the 2-week content was sometimes a band-aid to make sure the next content was ready, and then you switch to the 3-month cycle. Does that mean that these are a thing of the past and we shouldn't be expecting them in the future?
I mean, if there's an appropriate moment for us to do a 1-week league or something because it's cool or interesting, we could. To a certain extent, I don't know if they always... Usually the people who are playing in a 1 month or a 1 week are some of the people who are playing in the 3 months. And while we've got to do some cool things and do some experiments with them, I think you're much more likely to see a sort of a 1 week event than like a 1 month event. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, a 1 month event plays a lot like a 1 week one, only there's these 3 weeks tacked on the end.
Fair enough.
So with Atlas of World having this endgame focus, we're curious to hear if you guys have noticed any trends for the veteran players since you released that expansion.
So with existing players, the first thing to note is that we've got to have lots of different things for different veteran players. They're not all the same. It's not all our sort of existing players aren't after the same stuff. So the important thing really is there's got to be something for someone who's been playing a long time, something that they can choose to master. And I think we've been sort of continuously adding elements into the game which allow people to sort of go in and go sort of pick the thing they want to do. Say, this league I'm going to get better at this, or I'm going to do that. or just something where they get to go, I'm going to be the best at this, or at least be extremely notable. And they don't have to pick the same thing like every league. We do notice there are people who sort of might spend a league running at Zeri, and that's all they focus on, and then they sort of about a month they sort of peter out, and then they sort of log in and do some stuff, and then the next league they might have a completely different focus. But definitely what we've noticed is we've got to have those opportunities for mastery for them, and we've got to have a sort of sense of continuity as well. You can't sort of log in 3 months if you've say missed 3 months, or you've sort of finished the last league early, and have the game be completely different. There's got to be some new cool stuff, but we sort of can't sort of pull the rug out under from players and sort of give them something else.
So the veteran crowd, do you consider fairly dynamic, or does it more feel like the static type of crowd that's hard to really change or adapt to?
I think the important thing to note is it's not just one crowd. So we have our players, for example, who play standard, and that's all they do is they play standard. Ideally, what we do for them is we do some tiny changes and we rebalance a bit of stuff and leave well enough alone, and they'd play standard forever, as far as we could tell. And then we have our players who come in and play the leagues, and whether that's hardcore or the standard version. And they often have very different goals or different things they're up to. So the important thing to remember is not just sort of one community, and they don't all have the same requirements.
With the idea of all different kinds of players and having something for them, we've noticed a wide variety in the challenges, and overall the trend seems to be that the challenges are getting harder and grindier over time. Does GGG strongly feel that the challenges control the longevity and the difficulty that correlates to better player retention? And if possible, if you could explain the whole designing process with the challenges.
So I think if you look at our very early challenges, they were the ones that were the very grindy, difficult ones. We haven't asked players to get like every keystone and every notable since the first time we did that, which was an actual challenge, was get every notable and every keystone in the tree.
I still remember the uniques, where you had to have all of these uniques in your inventory at the same time. It's like pay so many exalts achievement.
Yeah. So definitely we started off with all 8 challenges are going to be pretty grindy. Use these currencies, included an eternal orb. And then I think we sort of softened on them and came to the 40 model, where there's sort of more a curve into it. You're definitely going to get some early. So you're always sort of seeing some progress, and you're always getting some stuff ticked off. As well as that, we've put a lot of effort into trying to work out where the cutoff point should be. So getting to 12 is one. It's got a reward. For most players, this is a reward for playing the game summon. For some players, this is what they're targeting and they're going for it. And then at 24, there's another reward, and players usually have to push a bit for that. And then at 36 is kind of okay, you're serious about these challenges, here's a reward. And where we've sort of probably increased the grindiness is from that 36 to 40, where the players who are generally engaging with those want a serious challenge. They actually tend to complain when they get 40 out of 40. If like someone gets 40 out of 40 in a week in, which is something we've had before, they then go, well, there's nothing left for me to do. There's 11 weeks in this league to go. So being able to have the challenges sort of spread for different players has helped. So generally we probably want 5 very difficult challenges, where to get to 36, you've got to do something difficult. You get to choose what really difficult thing it is, but you've got a choice. Whereas getting to 40, there should be this ramp up where actually getting to 40 feels very rewarding. And the difference between 36 and 37 and 37 and 38 all the way through like feels meaningful. And trying to find that balance is quite difficult. So we've done a lot of work on that early curve, which most of our players listening to this podcast probably won't notice at all, and it's mostly for players who are new to sort of have them get the challenges on a sort of a fairly even, even progression, and sort of start to notice them. And then the grindiness, we've sort of probably increased a bit towards the end, and I don't know if it's in the right place, but we'll have to have a look at that.
We've seen a recent trend or a change into some of the challenges, and I wanted to get your opinion on like the philosophy of buying achievements, like paying for a service fee to get somebody to do something very difficult, whereas we have these challenges that say get 10,000 map points or fulfill a prophecy 300 times, where it clearly is incentivizing you to actually do it yourself instead of paying somebody to do that for you.
Right. So the challenges which people sometimes consider, you just buy this challenge. Not everyone is buying that challenge, and there are people who are quite proud of getting to 40 out of 40 by doing all the challenges themselves. But what we have noticed is the challenges people respond most positively is to ones where they have some control over how fast they can achieve it or not. So the challenges where someone can say, well, I can pay for someone to give me a shaper kill. Generally, these are people who go in, well, I can get a lot of currency. I want to get the reward at 36 out of 36. But I'm not sure I'm actually that interested in making a build that kills shaper. And for the 10,000 map tier 1, you can sort of choose to do that faster or slower as well, or find a way to do it faster. You can say, I can do a tier 10 map very fast, and that's only 1,000 tier 10 maps. Or you can go, well, if I make my character better, I can do that with a tier 12 maps or tier 15. And assuming I've got the speed, I can do it much faster. And if someone's not that good, they can go, well, I could probably grind this out with tier 5 maps, for example. I'd like to think they're not doing that with tier 5 maps.
Take some time.
So an early experiment we did with this was the 1200 dried lake runs, where it was like, well, not many people will do this, but it's sort of an easy option that just takes time. And we found that lots of people actually chose the 1200 run, even if they didn't like it. Whereas the 10,000 map tiers, I think will get players who go, oh, I've already done 5,000 this league, and I wasn't even deciding to do that one. I guess it's not as hard as I thought. I'll push to do the rest. That one I tried, we asked a bunch of players, what do you think of this challenge? And the players who went 40 out of 40 actually responded very positively to that one. It was like, oh yeah, I can do that. That's not too hard. They're also the ones who immediately understood what it meant, because we were a bit worried about the wording. Does this make actually sense to people? But for the people who did like lots of challenges, they sort of immediately understood. Right. Whereas the players who sort of only got to 36 or below 36 kind of were like, oh, I'm not sure what this means, which was interesting. So in the end, we decided to go for it and said, well, we'll try this challenge. It's one of those challenges which is probably easier than it looks, but it sort of has this awesome, oh my God, 10,000, that's such a big number.
And back to the previous question, do you feel that the challenges often dictate the health of the league, like the player retention? How much of a figure?
I don't know. I mean, that helps a bit, particularly for players who sort of need some motivation. When I play a game, I kind of like there to be achievements or challenges or something like that, because it sort of gives me a focus.
Right.
That being said, we've got to be fairly careful. If people decide, you get this bit where they can take over if you're not careful, where people sort of focus on them, and then when they've done them, they stop. Whereas if they weren't there at all, they'd keep playing. Also, the difficulty curve is very important there. If they decide they're playing for the challenges and then they hit a point where it's too hard, then they'll stop, even if they might not have if they weren't there. So I think it assists, but it doesn't really... it helps that there's stuff to do. And there are players who respond very well to challenges and others who don't. So I think it's sort of part of the thing that makes people play, but it's not the be all end all. And the sort of the difficulty curve is not to do with players playing longer. It's to make sure that the people who go in for the totem pole and their reward is 40 out of 40 don't feel cheated by having it too easy. And then the 36 reward is kind of I have completed this, I've done what the league tells me to do.
So then from transitioning where challenges last in retaining players or keeping players interested, what's a decision that you guys have made that you feel is the strongest for keeping players interested in new leagues or the game in general?
So probably the strongest thing is actually performance of the game, and this is something which I have sort of the least to do with, so it hurts me to say this, but so obviously the sync changes which we had last year and things like increases in performance this year kind of mean there's less pain points where people go, oh, I like this game, but this bit is bullshit, or I died and it had nothing to do with how I played. So the better that's gotten has helped a lot. Other than that, there's been things like Forsaken Masters did a lot with the dailies where there's a thing to do. It adds a social element. Things like the Labyrinth for players who choose to do that, sort of having regular stuff. Atlas of Worlds helped a great deal because it sort of provided more focus on the end game. So there's been a lot of things we've done which have improved it over time. And the other thing that's helped is the regularity of the releases, the sort of the 3 monthly release. So I guess a lot of things have come together well. There's been the performance improvement, different kinds of content, often which has a social element or has something where you can decide at the beginning of the day, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do my master rotations. I think I'll do a labyrinth today, and then I'm going to do some mapping. And I want to improve like how many completions I've got on the Atlas. These things all add up to being, I have a reason to log in today and do something. Whereas if you sort of go, oh, I suppose I want to log in, but last time I died to some bullshit and I'm not sure what I'm doing other than mapping, maybe I'll do some dried lake runs. There's more sort of pull to sort of going, well, I guess I might not log in today. So I think it's just sort of having a pile of things that can be interesting and provide things for people to master, as well as just having better performance of the game.
That's something I can definitely attest to, because in 2.5, as you were talking about, it ended up being much cleaner comparison because of your development cycle and the scope. I haven't had a bullshit death yet, and it's making it one of the better enjoyments of the game.
With all the changes you've made, Carl, I'm kind of curious, is there any statistics that show whether or not there's more people moving to softcore or to hardcore, respectively?
So generally, we've probably had stronger and stronger players playing in the league. The hardcore version of the league, there's always sort of a minimum amount of players that gets, and we've had higher before when we had different versions of the game in each one. Like, so when there's a strong pull to do the hardcore version rather than the standard version, and there was like different mechanics, sometimes people would choose to do the hardcore one who might not otherwise do it. But I mean, there's sort of a regular amount who always play in hardcore. And then generally along the 3 months, there's sort of more of a drift into standard. Although, like I said, we have this sort of small core of players who always play standard, and that's all they play. So, but overall, I'd say the trend is more people playing in the challenge leagues than previously.
Okay.
In the Canterbury thing that you attended, you did mention that in 2013 the average player played 4 hours a day, and I was just curious, can you describe your definition of the average player in Path of Exile in 2016?
So I think an important thing I've learned is that there's not really an average player, and averages can be very deceptive. If you look at the sort of the average something that someone does, you can sort of be thrown off by, like, if there's a large group of people who do much less than the average and only a few who do more, for example. Yeah, so I guess the lesson is there's not really an average. We do use aggregated stats, obviously, and averages for looking at things, but it's dangerous to assume you have one community. And this is especially dangerous if you look at sort of feedback in only one or two places. Like if you're only looking at Reddit to get feedback of the game, you get quite a different result. If you watch streams and you look at what people are talking about, that's quite different as well.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say the average, I guess the average playtime has been increasing over time, or is it roughly the same from your previous?
Um, I'm not sure what it is currently, actually. I haven't looked at that particular stat. Generally, I think early on in the league, we have players who just sort of naturally have less time to play and have shorter play times. I think at that same Canterbury thing I said, it would probably be better if our average play time was shorter, because it just means we have more players. Because if the average play time is like session is 4 hours, you're obviously only getting like sort of players who are super hardcore and playing super long sessions.
The no
Whereas
lifers.
that's not the word I used, but
What is the
That's
word?
fun.
which are players we love and we have a lot of time for. They're kind of sort of a focus of the game and what we have. But the having a a bunch of players at the moment, I wouldn't be surprised if the average play time was a little bit lower. But I don't actually know what the figures are at the moment.
Okay.
So going to a little bit of a different gear then, some of the times when we get new content, you get something tweaked, like the Malachi encounter when he was first introduced. And at what point does a mob become too lethal so that it requires an adjustment?
Right. So when a mob becomes too lethal, so one for a monster or a boss, the answer is not always the same. It's not like as soon as this many people die, we've got to tweak it down, or if too few people die, tweak it up. So a lot of monsters or bosses have an excuse to be very deadly, and some have an excuse to be less deadly. So Malachi has an important role. He is sort of an end of act roadblock, and at the time the map Malachi was sort of the toughest content in the game, and it's important that that is an actual challenge for people, so that they can say, well, I went and did that. And then when we looked at the structure of the Atlas, it was a bit weird that we had this sort of tier of 4 things leading up to the Guardians, and one looked completely different to the other 3. So it made sense to improve the structure and sort of reduce the difficulty of that. And we had sort of new challenges following that, where we had the 4 Guardians and then the Shaper. We do have some monsters where we look at like Trisker, I get the name right, the one in Calm's area.
That's a pain
totem
in the
boss.
ass.
Yeah.
And we kind of like that, and we do want it to be there, but that's something we've looked at, and we've got to make this more optional. Players are not actually choosing to go kill it. It's not something people are identifying and something to go, well, my build can kill that, so that's awesome. So that's probably not sort of worthy of its deadliness at the moment. Whereas something like Dureso, yes, Dureso should be something most players fear. And it's also good to have sort of variety of lethality of like sort of general bosses and packs as well. It's good to have a sort of a variable experience in maps. But that being said, we don't want ones where you go into a map and you look at them and you go, I think I'll just leave now. I didn't need to do that map anyway. So too lethal is making people like the game too unpleasant for people, and they don't have a choice about whether they're doing that content or not.
Does it ever get to the point where sometimes the statistics just don't tell you enough, that you actually need like video footage of something actually happening to determine whether or not it was unfair? Like, I'm wondering if there's just like some rip reel that you guys just show up in a conference room and check out a rip, that was fair or that was unfair. I mean, does that happen?
I mean, there have been moments where things can be quite different on like video setups for someone, or lag makes a huge difference. Like an example of this might be early on the Val boss, the Act 2 boss, the Oversoul. There's these rocks that fall. and lots of players complained about those. But there was actually some signaling for that, but that's not always obvious when there's a lot of lag or various other things. So we sort of had to improve that, and that's the kind of thing where if there's video footage, you can look at it and go, well, I guess they don't have any warning in this case, or that is very difficult. But in general, we should have a fair idea. So I mean, it's not often that video footage is generally better, but there are cases where it is. That's not a reason to all suddenly send us lots of video, because then one thing about video is you can only consume it so fast, where stats you get to aggregate a huge amount of information at once. But definitely a combination of the two can be helpful.
So you're saying you get a lot of spam?
We get a lot of messages from people.
So when we go ahead, Eddie.
I was just saying Reddit is a great place for people trying to like uphold justice. They're like, look at this is unfair. How do they think that this is fair? And it gets upvoted a jillion times.
Yeah.
And now that we're mentioning Reddit, if we are talking or going into the CI live thing, we kind of get the feeling that when we read a Reddit that 100% of the Path of Exile population is playing Energy Shield and 0% is playing live. And we would like to ask you, Carl, if you have these stats, how many in percentages above level 90 have spec'd into either CI or Arcane Vision in hardcore and softcore separately?
So this is probably going to be a little bit inexact, but when you asked it, I did go have a look at. Part of this is because when we look at passive choices, the way we aggregate it sort of doesn't answer this easily, but it looks to be about 50%-ish for people sort of doing some sort of CI build or strongly energy shield build, which is actually pretty high. Like that is unusually high, particularly if it's a bit over 50%, which it might be. So yeah, it's certainly very popular at the moment.
What do you consider like a healthy ratio between life and energy shield users in general? What are you aiming for?
Healthy? I personally like it when there's people choosing to do a wide range of different kind of builds. So there's people doing CI and people doing hybrid and people doing with very leech focused builds, people doing with high life regen sort of builds, people doing just strictly high life. So, and my ideal is that people would sit down and argue about which one is best. So whether it's not clear what kind of build is best and that there's sort of a wide variety of options.
So then going from there, the difficult question, what do you think is better, the life or CI?
So depending under the conditions, probably at the moment CI is looking very strong.
Okay, you made Reddit happy.
But you need to be very careful, obviously, if we make changes for that, because we're obviously not just making a value judgment of which one we think is better. When we make a value judgment like that, that leads to changes, and there are already some sort of subtle changes to light joules, the availability of getting energy shield in this league, which we need to have a look and see how much that has affected things. So one, CI used to be, or generally considered, a very good but extremely difficult to build for and extremely expensive thing to do. No one was doing CI in the first week. And then over time, there'd be better and better energy shield gear coming out. And then towards the end of the league, people would start to complain, CI is too strong. And then beginning of the next league, people will go, you nerf CI, I've swapped into CI and there's nothing there. Where we hadn't necessarily changed anything, it was just what gear you have and what your expectations of how good it would be. Whereas at the moment, we've provided a lot of tools. We've also provided tools for life builds, but it turns out that the availability of the gear turned up quite a lot, particularly with the Essence League. A lot of people started to realize what the benefits were. So part of it is also an awareness for people of what builds work well for what. And part of that was also the sort of content people were choosing to do. We'd sort of added this Atlas content. We thought not many people will be interested in this, but the core players will love it. And then it turns out that lots of people like the Atlas progression and we're very keen to do that kind of content. I suspect if a while back we hadn't changed how labyrinth mechanics worked with energy shield. If you'll remember back, there were a lot of complaints that CI is broken and the energy shield is broken because you have to go life so you can do the labyrinth properly. And we made changes to that to sort of even things out. So there aren't a lot of impediments to playing a sort of a CI or energy shield based build at the moment. And they turn out pretty well. And we even did discuss leading into 2.5.0, do we want to hit sort of CI specifically rather than hitting energy shield? Like, do we want to actually make changes to CI? And at the time it was like, we're trying to make this decision pretty close to, we can get into trouble making a decision like that beforehand and accidentally, like if we sort of overpitch the mark and we sort of ruin CI as such, and then people playing in the league say you've kind of ruined my preferred way to play and you've ruined my plans, that generally goes across very poorly. And as well as that, we've done some other changes, like energy from within have been reduced slightly, and people go, well, that wasn't much of a nerf, but often the differences are very subtle if you look at it. It doesn't always require much of a nerf to have a big effect. So at the moment, we're kind of like, let's wait and see. CI is looking pretty good. And there are people here on the balance team who are going, look, I can make very good life characters who can survive all this content, often better than the CI ones. And as well as that, once people were killing Shaper with non-CI characters, a lot of the opinions about, oh, CI had this very early success and then people are sort of succeeding on the content with all sorts of other builds. Opinions swayed a bit there. So at the moment, it's still looking like CI is very strong. I still think life isn't looking bad. Hybrid isn't looking bad. Maybe it needs some extra stuff. Low life builds, they're a bit unpopular at the moment, but I suspect they're a bit stronger than their unpopularity deserves. So we'll have a look and we'll see how that goes out, but it is something on our radar and something we're going to pay attention to.
Well, something that's a little bit interesting there is when you talked about having to nerf it and not trying to destroy it. How does that end up going on a debate with any of the mechanics? Because that has to be a very difficult thing when something needs to be changed, but it's very easy because of how close the numbers are to just destroy its popularity entirely.
So I think it's something that in general we've gotten better with. Part of this is having more people involved in the balance who are very sort of aware and active in the game. So we've got sort of a team of people who look at this across sort of the design team and the QA team. And a lot of the QA team are very sort of active players and they play in a variety of different ways, but they're generally playing very time intensive sort of long-term versions. And as well as that, they can test with sort of natural characters and they can also go, well, assuming unlimited sort of ability to make a character, I can make this. And they get quite fast at doing that. So I think when we've often had sort of the general sort of community going, you should nerf this, we do change it and then a lot of people go, oh no, you've ruined it, and then people try it and go, this is still perfectly good, I can still use the skill, you guys failed. And it's like, well, we didn't really want to stop you using it entirely. We did want you to be able to continue using it, and Surprise. If it was like this is an in-game super good tool and it's breaking the game and it's better than the other things people are trying to play in game, we still want it to be a thing you can choose and do okay at, or if you've popped back into the game that you're still doing okay with it. We just don't want it to be the sort of the dominant thing people are choosing.
Mm-hmm.
Just reminds me of the Valspark quote of this has been nerfed in every way possible.
Trying to get the message across here.
Yeah, I think one of the honorable mentions of like the most impactful nerfs, I guess, with a large percentage of the community would be COC nerfs. That change was quite some time ago and it was very, very accessible. And I was just wondering what was the overall reception to, the state of COC right now with your players.
So people are definitely still playing cast on crit kind of builds. I don't know if it's all, like a lot of new players at the time were going, okay, I've seen this cast on crit thing, it looks awesome, I want to do it. In the triggered kind of thing, we've recently added the option with the cast on channel, which when you first get it is sort of much easier to build for. I think cast on crit probably at the moment ends up better after a while, but the cast on channel sort of just works when you get the gem. So one, there's a few more choices in that triggered thing, and we want there to be other options as well. We don't want people to go, well, these triggered skills are the only way to go. I'm going to make an automated build. I think part of that is us going, okay, there is a benefit to automation of a build that is just the automation, and we have to sort of bear that in mind, that that is worth something by itself. It doesn't have to necessarily do exactly the same or be as defensive and that kind of thing. So there is some benefit to it, value in itself, when I get to do something which happens automatically rather than I am choosing to do. And players choosing to do something should be pretty impactful, if that makes sense.
Right. So moving into the breach topic, I think I speak for all of us, or I know I speak for all of us, in saying that we have enjoyed the breach challenges so far. How do you feel the general user reception of this league has been compared to others?
Extremely good. So both, it was enticing to people. In fact, probably less enticing than some other leagues where people looked at it and went, well, I want to play, but breach, whatever, it didn't like offend anyone. And then when people are playing it, they're responding very positively to breach. Breach originally was like, well, we'll get this done in 6 weeks and focus on other things, and it turned out to take most of the development time to make it anyway. But that being said, it was ready earlier than normal. So the initial concepts of it, I think, came from Nick, and then Rory did a lot of the sort of initial design lead. He's, when I mentioned that you get the sort of person who takes it from 0 to 95%, and then the person who takes it from 95 to 99, sort of Rory was definitely in that 0 to 95 sort of role, where he sort of worked out the maths of the breaches and a lot of the plans for the monsters and how it worked. And then we had Neon Spider, or Mark II, sorry, too many names for him, but he was sort of got it across the finish line, and then it was good. There were a few times internally where it's like, is this fun? And occasionally it was like, we're trying to play it and we can't. But there was a lot of iteration, and it had a great reception and people enjoy it. And so, yeah, it was pretty awesome.
So then how does the impression of the community on the first week affect the current development? You're obviously always working ahead of time, but then you're dealing with feedback of stuff that you're trying to push off and deal with another problem.
So obviously we do pay attention to the feedback, because one, it's our work and we like to see how it's taken, and two, it does sort of impact other things. It's like, well, the next league's got to respond to some of that, and as well as that, we want to go, what do we need to change about this league? We don't want to change it too much, because then it's not the same and people complain that the first week experience was different, but sometimes there are things that need changes.
With the overall breach, and players are having a lot of fun with the swarm of mobs, and you get a boost in XP in all your maps, you get better loot. The overall design of this, are there some serious concerns about player expectations in the future? I mean, honestly, I felt like this league, I was anticipating, a lackluster one because it's the second league of an expansion, but this one is probably one of my favorite ones. And, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. I was actually curious also, how many players are actually making it into white, yellow, and red maps?
So the first part of that question was, are we worried that the reception's so good it's hard to follow? Is that basically the question?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's a good problem to have. If people are enjoying it so much, we're worried that we can't top it. This year we've had quite a lot of leagues where that sort of thing has come up. It's like, how are you going to top the rewardiness of Perandus, for example? And it turns out you don't really need to. People enjoy it for what it is at the time, and then the next league comes across and it's got something else. And then there was Prophecy, which, as you know, is basically still in the game, and it was received well. And then we had Essence League, and people were going, well, people are going to get used to this easily available crafting. So it does seem people are quite tolerant of, the league has a cool thing, I'll accept it while it's there. The next league, it'll have different things and different focuses, and that's fine. we certainly don't want to go, well, we've got to make a bad league now so people don't always expect it to be good. We're always trying to make a great league. So I guess it's the onus is on us to make sure that the leagues continue to be awesome. The second part of that question was what sort of content players are playing in, was like what tiers of maps they're in. So these are stats from the first sort of part of the league. So I think at the moment in maps, people sort of regularly doing maps, we're only at about sort of 25% of people, like 25% of people's time are in maps. And that's sort of transitioning from like the sort of the white maps. We've got about 12% of time being spent to the second tier where it's sort of like 8% of time being spent, with not that much in the red tier of maps, where probably only sort of 2% of people's time are spent in that. To give a sort of comparison, like 25% of people of time spent is in sort of merciless areas at the moment. But there is that kind of transition happening as people are sort of going deeper into the tiers, particularly as the sort of the white tier and the yellow tier have got pretty similar numbers. That being said, there will be players who just sort of stick around the sort of the white tiers and sort of dip into the second tier, whereas the ones pushing into the Atlas will be the ones that sort of drive those stats.
Clarify something. When you say time spent, that doesn't include times like AFKing in a town or a hideout, right? It's actually...
no, I've excluded those ones.
Okay.
But we have time spent for those as well. This is time spent basically killing monsters and getting loot.
Okay.
But it's so fun to decorate the hideout.
That's true.
I had fun with it last league. Not a sarcastic comment. One of the things about Breach is it going to be possible to deal with the, I said invisible, but they're also invincible mobs. So as the mobs get spawned from the Breach mechanic, if you move out and leash them, those mobs can still attack, do damage to you. Is this intentional to encourage you to stand in the Breach? Is this something that's getting addressed?
Okay, so where do I start with this? So there's this concept we use a lot in a lot of things called hysteresis, which is basically the state of something is the state it held previously within certain bounds. So we use this a lot for auras, for example. Auras have a radius. When you're into that radius, you sort of get the aura, but the radius for which you lose that aura is bigger than the one for getting it. So there's this sort of band around the outside where whether you have the aura or not depends on whether you already had the aura. And we use this a lot. So things like Searing Bond has hysteresis, so it's sort of harder to leave a beam than it is to enter it. Now, the reason I brought this up is this is entirely related on the fact that there is this kind of band where you get invisible monsters, which can cause people problem, and it's a result of, to get the mechanic working, it's basically the only way it could end up working. So it's not really the intent of it, it's the result of other things that need to happen for this mechanic to work at all. So there is this thing at the very edge of this. Now, when we looked at it, players running away from the breach is too dangerous, I'm running away. They very quickly get sort of past this band, so it doesn't really hurt them. And people fighting deeply in the breach don't have a problem with it because they're busy fighting monsters. So it is a little bit problematic that there is this sort of like fine edge where there are potential for monsters to sort of be invisible and cause problems. But we don't really have a solution for it. So it's sort of the only way the breaches could work. When this was coming up a lot, we did look at it, and Jonathan suggested a solution, and we looked at the solution. It was what we were already doing.
Swinging
well, I mean, it was good that we'd already put that into place.
Yeah.
So the thing, learn not to hang around on the very edge of a breach. If you need to go pick up a chest, sort of run to the edge, and if you're running away from the breach, just keep running. So that's probably what I can say about that. We'll look at it further, but the result of the sort of the hysteresis mechanic to make the breach work at all means this is an unfortunate side effect at the moment.
Before we continue, we did say that we just have you for an hour. Can you give us a few more minutes? Do you need to go? Are you busy, or how do you feel on your time frame?
I can keep going for a bit.
Okay,
Soon
just yell at us if you're running out of time. Not a problem.
Okay, sure.
All right. So with that said, which of the Breach Lords have killed the most players, and which of the encounters have been failed by most players so far? How do you feel about the balance between the Breach Lords?
So the first thing I'll note is the Breach Lord that's killed the most players is Tull. Both by raw volume
Fucking Tull.
and by percentage. So Kyula and Ulnatol are also pretty scary, but they're being done a bit less. Players are, sort of intimidated out of them. As for how do I feel about the balance, they don't all need to be equal. It is fine if there's one that people are scared about. And I think if you actually look at the Beyond stuff, for example, there was a particular Beyond boss that people were generally more scared of. And it was also the cold aligned one. So the fact that those two deadly bosses may have to deal with each other in some respect may mean that one is a bit stronger. So I think it is good that there are things that players are scared of, and I don't think the bosses need to be all equal. I would be worried if there was one who was considered too much of a pushover. I do think once people start doing Kyula potentially more regularly, they may also sort of become quite scared of Kyula or maybe Ulnatol as well. But yeah, at the moment, by raw kills and percentage-wise, it would be Tull that's the most deadly.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question regarding balance. How important is balance when you compare it against new content? Can you explain the balance process at GGG and how many people that are involved in it?
Okay, so balance is obviously not a small topic. It's a sort of a big deal what we do. And the kind of games I was making before I started at GGG were like sort of Euro games, where often the balance is like super sort of like for a 1 hour to 2 hour experience, it's got to be pretty precise and it's very focused on the strategy. So part of this is should everything be balanced, like precisely balanced so that everything's an equal choice? In the style of game we've got, the answer is generally no. For example, in the passive tree, early work I did on it, I was very focused on every decision must hurt. When I look at the passive tree, it should be a real question of which way do I go? Given any passive tree, the choice of the next point should be a very difficult thing. It turns out that sort of decision pain is mostly unpleasant for people. I tend to like games with lots of decision pain, and one of the best things we actually did with the passive tree was sort of remove some of that decision pain and actually go, hey, there are these big notable nodes. They've got names. You can talk to people about them and you can give someone advice like, go get that node. It's a big one. It gives you a signal, go over there. And then you can still have sort of moments of mastery in that where you go, I'm going to go this other path less taken and go do this other thing, or rush to this notable, missing this notable. But actually sort of debalancing the passive tree, if you will, and giving sort of big impactful points where you're going, this point doesn't mean too much, this doesn't mean too much, and then I get a big payoff node. Where the balance still is important between people's trees, and when people look at it, they go, I kind of get a fair amount for my points, and you get a fair amount for your points. But not every decision hurts. Not every decision is sort of like this finely tuned thing. And then as the game is played, there's different content to do different things. And another part of that is learning early on that every build also is an impossible chance task to get balanced. We can't go, there are 100 to 1,000 or whatever sort of build archetypes, and at every point in the game and at end game, these must be all balanced against one another. The first problem with that is we don't have time. You wouldn't get a league out every 3 months if we went, we'll just wait till we've got this perfectly balanced first. But also it's not necessarily useful for us. When I was sort of very early on tweaking balance. Often I'd sort of make these changes, and almost every time I did something to try and make the game balance between lots of builds, the main thing we get to notice is a whole bunch of players disappear. So it's okay that there's some builds that aren't as good as others, but you do want the builds that are good and the builds people are playing at endgame, there's got to be some sort of parity between them. So it doesn't need to be whatever I choose is fine, but it has to be, of these things, when I choose one, I choose the one that appeals to me, and it's not fair if someone else's choice is better. It's also easier to balance that way. If we go, there are these general 20 archetypes for kind of game builds people are playing the end game, we can worry about these, and we can also worry about the fact we might enable another build that is an end game. It sort of makes it easier. So balance is important, but not necessarily as important and overreaching as you might think, if that makes sense. And this required looking at a lot of other games which are sort of large and expansive and just have a ton of content, because part of the appeal is there is a ton of stuff in Path of Exile. And if you look at games with a ton of content, generally they don't have sort of perfect balance without. When you make a Euro game, you get to go, it's got these 100 elements, and we can make sure it's all perfectly balanced, but that's literally because it's small and elegant. Where if you've got a large Baroque game, you've kind of got to sort of pick what you're focusing on.
So then I want to ask a quick question related to that. You're not going to be able to balance everything exactly as you've said, and it can be a bad thing. Do you have like upper and lower bounds? Because a lot of the time, you get the glacial hammer 6%, and people are like, interesting. So maybe it's a bit too specific for the time frame, but I just wondering if you had any insight into how you pick the 2 weak and the 2 strong spectrum.
So with Glacial Hammer 1, this is a skill you get on the beach, and it's very single target focused. So it has a particular role, and it's actually very good at the role it has. If one plays with Glacial Hammer, one can do some pretty impressive things with it. However, what you're not doing with it is clearing maps at the speed other people are clearing maps. When we did look at rebalancing a bunch of melee skills, there were a bunch of sort of ones thrown in, and we played with some high numbers. And the Glacial Hammer thing came back with, well, we'll increase this one by 6%. So part of it is what its role is. 2, there's probably something very exploitable you can do with it, but it's not that it'd be exploitable for running maps. And also Glacial Hammer does sort of have the strong role in Cutthroat. So every time a Cutthroat league comes up, we get asked to nerf Glacial Hammer. I am not kidding at all. It is probably enemy number 1 as far as people who I go play Cutthroat, and then I just keep dying to Glacial Hammer.
I'm just asking for more Cutthroat.
That's a reasonable question. So yes, it would be cool if we looked at Glacial Hammer and went, we've got to find a way to make an in-game build for this that's actually viable. And I do believe that's something people have looked at. Whether it will happen, I can't make any promises for, but there's some ideas for, adding tools to various other things. We obviously, when I say, well, we only need sort of 20 sort of in-game templates, obviously we don't always want them to be the same, and it's obviously cool when someone finds something in a cool way to do something and it elevates it up. There are plenty of hooks in the game for people to find cool things to do and to suddenly get to do something people weren't expecting.
Right,
Well,
so-
with that, sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that. With your 90 plus staff, how many people get to weigh in on something like the balance of a certain skill? Like, how many people are involved in that process?
So we have a lot of people who make suggestions, but as far as the people who are sort of corely involved in that process,
Right.
like I said before, is we have a group of designers and a group of QA who are very focused on that task. For a skill in particular, there's also the question of, if we introduce a new skill, it doesn't help if the skill sucks, if that makes sense. We want it to be reasonably good. And I mean, even then we've got things like people weren't too pleased with the way sort of Blight went out, and it was like, well, it's level 1 skill, it's got a particular role. QA looked at it, they sort of found values. We looked at when maybe it's too low, and it turned out people didn't really like it at the values it went out. So on the other hand, to really make people stand up and take notice and go, this skill is awesome, I'm running it, you're competing with whatever the best skills out there are. And if you keep making skills hit that value, then eventually you get to the point where all the new skills keep being better than the last lot, and that's not so useful. And we want people to be able to also work out how to build these skills. We don't want them to just sort of be plug and play, there's your awesome, although we do want them to be awesome, obviously, but it's not like I swapped one skill gem out and put a new one in, and now it's better than ever it was before. So there's a lot of iteration and process and sort of discussing what its role is and what it's meant to be doing. For the very final values, that sort of focuses on the sort of the QA members of the balance team, whose time's pretty pressured, but they take a lot of effort to look at it.
So we probably shouldn't take too much more of your time, Carl, but I have one last question here. I've been doing lots of Uberlab runs, and I'm curious as to why breaches or essences, the new league mechanics, aren't in the Uberlab or
right,
labs
so,
in general.
So part of this is whenever we look at sort of adding new content, we've got to work out where it works and where it doesn't work. Part of this is people who run the Uberlab are there for a very specific purpose. So they're either getting their ascendancy points, which is obviously an important thing, or they're sort of actively running it to, on a sort of a regular basis. So one, it doesn't quite sort of fit the role of what the Uberlab is to suddenly throw breaches in it. And it's kind of cool when we have the new mechanics and they interact with everything and they have cool and wacky results. But the Uberlab people generally want to be fairly focused and play the game of sort of either optimizing their way through or getting through it all. And those are sort of similar tasks, only one is more, I am running the Uberlab and I'm going to do it fast, I'm going to get a lot of keys, or I want my damn ascendancy points, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to get through it this time.
Just give us a different way of getting them.
So the Uberlab has this task, and when we discussed it, it was like, okay, that's sort of not where the league is meant to go. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Hedgie, do you have a final question?
Nope. I'm good.
You sure? The only one that I want to ask, you kind of talked about it with the CI and life. What is too popular in terms of player and like maybe their itemization, if everyone's running at Series Promise or passive nodes? What's too popular?
Too popular. Okay. So the first thing I'll note is it's okay if sometimes in a league something sort of becomes a slightly more a part of the league, and everyone goes, "I remember that league where everyone ran CI." And it wouldn't be everyone, but people will remember it as everyone. That being said, obviously, if people feel compelled to do something they don't want to do, then it's too popular. If everyone goes, you've got to go a bow builds are the best, and someone goes, well, I hate playing bow builds, but I guess I have to, then that is too popular. I don't think we've ever really hit that point with that, but occasionally we get things which things become powerful enough that people feel compelled to do them even if they don't enjoy them. That's definitely too popular. Also, if something becomes so good and entrenched that we can't tempt them with something else, if it's like this build is extremely strong and there's no loot that can drop that would ever matter for them, then this is a problem, because part of the game is desirability for things. And if like there's something which you just take this passive and you use this gem and bam, it all works, and then you don't need any gear, and everyone starts doing it, then that sort of like it cuts out a part of the game. So that would be too popular. If we look at the numbers, if you get some sort of something glaringly ahead, then obviously you can say that's too popular. For example, with say ascendancy classes, it doesn't worry out necessarily within a sort of a group of 3 that goes with the core class if there's 2 that are more popular than the other. But if people only take 1, then that's a problem. And as well, if you look at the ascendancy classes as a whole, we don't necessarily want need all 19 to be absolutely equally taken. But if there's sort of one or two that are clearly ahead of everything else, that's too popular. But if it was like, these ones definitely sort of have a tier 1 and these ones have sort of a tier 2, that's not the end of the world. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it seems to tie in what you were talking about, is you really want to make sure that there's that decision fatigue. Certain people don't like it, but that's the core that you're trying to keep.
Opportunity costs, yeah.
Now, Hedgie, though, didn't have a question before, fucked up, and now he does have a question. Yeah. So, Hedgie, what's your final question?
Well, I felt like in the past you really mastered with the patching system, where it was pretty seamless. Now that we have two different clients, the DX9 and DX11, they seem to have their own independent problems. Is the friction back?
Is the friction back? How do you mean, with actually trying to patch, or?
Yeah, like you mentioned player friction, or the friction that would cause from the patches that you guys would implement, like a huge drop off.
Oh, so I don't think so, no. But with DX11, first thing to note is it is still in beta. While it's there, it does notably say beta on it. So there are still a few things being worked on with the DX11. Like, I know coming up, there's going to be a huge change which should do a bunch of stuff with it. The biggest thing for me personally when I'm looking at the DX11 stuff is that the QA process takes more time. We've got to test everything with DX9 and DX11 and DX9EX, and then we have to sort of test it with every combination of those and lockstep and predictive, which is not necessarily a problem, but if we've got anything that touches the rendering, it's just more of a testing burden from this side. But I don't think I've sort of noticed any problems with the players, and there are definitely improvements coming with the DX11, which I'm pretty excited to see make it into the game.
Any performance improvements we're excited to see.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
That being said, before we do a close-up, is there anything that you either want to further express a point, something we went over that maybe we skimmed or didn't understand because we're stupid here? And any last words?
No, I think that's all good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Carl, on behalf of everybody. Thanks, everyone, for joining the Lioneye podcast. For those who didn't manage to catch the start of it, it's going to be fully uploaded onto Hegemony's YouTube later. And then next week, we'll be doing a normal one without a guest. For those who are not familiar, Carl's essentially the right-hand man at GGG. You could think of him as foreman. He makes sure everything is going in the right place. So next week is Christmas, though. We'll have a little bit of a surprise for that. And once again, Carl, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.